Chapter 53 of The Seventh Most Important Thing by Shelley Pearsall. Mr. Hampton's art is going to a museum? Squeak practically launched out of his chair in Arthur's kitchen when he told him. He'd come over for lunch after being away for the 4th of July weekend. Of course, he'd brought his own foil-wrapped food with him. Yeah, I guess. That's what Officer Billy told me, Arthur shrugged, as if it were no big deal, and kept eating his ham sandwich. Which museum? Squeak asked, still talking extra loudly. National Collection of Fine Arts. One of the Smithsonian's? Squeak shrieked. He was so loud, Barbara came running from the living room to see what was going on. Hampton's work is going to be at the Smithsonian? Squeak shrieked again. Seriously, Squeak, tone down a little. Arthur waved his sister away. They were just putting it in storage, not in the museum. Well, it's better than sitting in an old garage in an alley, isn't it? Squeak still couldn't contain his excitement. He pushed his entire packet of vanilla creams toward Arthur. Here, you can have all my cookies to celebrate, he said, patting him on the shoulder. Congratulations! Smiling, Arthur shook his head. Sometimes Squeak could be such a pinhead. The seventh most important thing. On the last Saturday in July, Arthur decided to take one more walk to Mr. Hampton's garage. He knew he didn't have to go there at all. His probation was over. The judge had suspended the rest of his sentence for good behavior, and Officer Billy had officially released him from being one of her kids, with another tin of caramel corn as a gift. The landlord had rented the garage to a new tenant, and the museum people had already finished packing up Hampton's throne. They'd been working in the garage all week, according to Groovy Jim. But Arthur wanted to see the place one last time. It was a beautiful summer morning. Arthur couldn't help thinking that it would have been a great day for collecting the 7 most important things. In the brilliant sunlight, he could see the world as perfectly as if it was outlined. He kind of felt like he was outlined too. Arthur T. Owens against the bright blue sky. The sun warmed Arthur's neck. He thought about how almost a year had gone by without his dad. He felt like a different person. It felt like a different life. Would the judge call this redemption? He wasn't sure. He was definitely taller and stronger now. Maybe that was what pushing a grocery cart through the snow and sheet for months did to a person. A lot of his clothes didn't fit anymore. He was starting to get pale wisps of hair on his upper lip, he'd noticed, and that was funny and weird at the same time. A lot of things were funny and weird to him these days, like being the director of special projects for the State of Eternity. He'd never told anyone about the title Mr. Hampton had given him before he died, not even Squeak. But remembering it always made Arthur feel secretly proud, as if he had a superhero side nobody knew about. Maybe because he was so lost in his own thoughts, the walk to the garage seemed a lot shorter than it usually did. In no time at all, Arthur was standing outside the familiar corrugated door with the drippy address numbers. The morning sunlight had just reached the garage. It glinted off the 3 glass bottles of Nesbitt sodas still pouring out their guilt and regrets onto the ground. Arthur was glad to see that the landlord hadn't gotten rid of them yet. Taking a deep breath, he pulled Mr. Hampton's keys out of his pocket and opened the door. He knew the garage would be empty when he switched on the lights. He had prepared himself for the emptiness. Still, it was a shock to see almost nothing left in the space where Hampton's shimmering heavenly creation had once been. The first thought that whispered through Arthur's mind was that maybe it had never been there. Maybe he had imagined the whole thing. Don't be stupid, he told himself. Of course it had been there. He walked slowly across the cement floor, noticing how his footsteps, even his breathing, seemed to echo loudly into the emptiness. The museum people had left a few things piled in one corner of the garage. There were some boxes of broken mirrors and bottles and light bulbs Mr. Hampton hadn't used, and his office chair, and the familiar grocery cart. It was the shopping cart that got to Arthur the most. "It's a chariot," Mr. Hampton had told Barbara. "You just can't see the horses." Arthur knew there was no way he could leave the rusty bucket cart behind. Not after he had pushed the thing around the neighborhood for months. Not when he knew exactly where to kick the right front wheel to make it turn. Not when he had finally figured out how to get the bone-rattling noise to stop by putting heavy stuff in the bottom of it first. Surprisingly, a couple of bricks came in handy for this. Arthur tugged Hampton's chariot from behind the boxes. He knew his mother would have a fit about keeping a rusty grocery cart in their garage. He'd have to come up with some excuse about storing his basketballs in it or something. As Arthur pushed the cart across the cement floor, he took one last look around. It was hard to leave the place, even if it was just a run-down garage at the end of an alley. He wished he knew where he'd done the right thing. He wished Mr. Hampton had given him more directions before he died, or told him what to do. Had he saved the artwork or ruined it, he wondered. Would anybody ever see Mr. Hampton's unbelievable creation again? And that was when Arthur noticed the square piece of cardboard in the middle of the garage floor. It looked like the torn flap of a box. He shook his head, thinking there was no way the cardboard was a message from Mr. Hampton. It was just a scrap that had been left behind by the museum people when they were packing up. Some piece they had forgotten. Still, he couldn't resist picking up the piece and looking at it, just to check, just to be sure. On the other side, he found 7 letters carefully cut out of silver metallic foil and glued on the cardboard. which had been covered with purple paper. Arthur's breath caught in his throat as he read them. The 7 letters spelled out 2 words. Fear not. 7 years later. Arthur didn't want to wear a suit to the reception. His mother insisted. "This is a big deal," she said. "I don't care if you're too grown up for me to fuss over anymore. I want you looking nice. I want to be proud of you." She tugged at the sleeves of the new dark blue jacket and smoothed the fabric across his broad shoulders. He was 21 now, and as tall as his father had ever been, and he had his father's stubbornness about getting dressed up for anything. "There, it fits you perfectly. Look!" Arthur's mom spun him around to face the mirror in the bathroom. "You are handsome enough to make me cry." Her voice trembled a little, and Arthur rolled his eyes. "Please, Mom." "Roger, Barbara, come look at Arthur," his mother called before he could stop her. Of course, Roger had to stick his head in the tiny bathroom, with Barbara right behind him. They were both decked out for the occasion, too. Barbara was wearing a yellow dress with a big summer hat and white gloves, which Arthur thought was a little over the top, but she was 14, and you couldn't tell her anything these days. "Now, all you need is a nice girl to marry, Artie," she teased. "Oh, you be quiet," his mom scolded. Actually, Arthur did have a nice girl he was dating. Her name was Carol, and he'd met her at the city college where he was taking a couple of classes in design and architecture. But he wasn't spilling the beans about going out with her. Not yet. Which was typical of Arthur. "Jiminy, everybody looks awfully sharp," Roger said. Like Arthur, he was wearing a suit, the same one he'd worn when he'd married Arthur's mom at the courthouse 4 years before. Arthur had been his best man. "Are you sure I look all right?" Arthur's mom peered anxiously into the bathroom mirror. She was wearing too much blue eyeshadow, and her hair was piled kind of high on her head, but Arthur told her she looked perfect. The 4 of them got into Roger's white Cadillac to go to the reception. He'd had the white walls scrubbed and the leather seats cleaned. The car smelled of lemons. Arthur could have preferred to drive himself there, but his mother had wanted them all to arrive together. He suspected she was afraid he wouldn't show up on time. The reception started at 6, and Arthur was always late. The first person Arthur spotted when they pulled into the parking lot downtown was Squeak, which made him relax a little. Arthur had invited him, and he'd driven down from Boston to be there. He was heavier and rounder now, with thicker black glasses. But he was still Squeak. Once Roger had the car safely in the space, Arthur leaped out to flag him down. "Squeak! Squeak!" Squeak looked confused and then embarrassed. "You made it," Arthur said, pounding him on the back. "Good to see you, man." They hadn't seen each other much since the end of high school. Squeak was going to Boston College, majoring in physics, of course. "Reginald, not Squeak," Squeak said, smiling wider. "I wouldn't have recognized you. You look like a preacher or something in that fancy suit." "I know," Arthur grinned. "I feel like an idiot in it." "So you excited for tonight?" Squeak pointed at the entrance of the art museum, where a crowd of well-dressed people were already lined up on the wide steps, waiting for the reception. A colorful banner saying, "Hampton's Throne, opening soon," flapped in the warm evening breeze. "I'm not sure yet," Arthur replied, which was the truth. It had been 7 years since he'd last seen Hampton's Throne, 7 years since he'd been a juvenile delinquent with a probation officer, 7 years since he'd gone around the neighborhood collecting the 7 most important things with a grocery cart, more than 7 years since his dad had died. It was so long ago it didn't even feel like his own life when he thought about it. But he knew there would be a few people at the reception to remind him. Groovy Jim was there. Arthur had called the shop to let him know about the event, and he could already spot him in the crowd. A tall, hippie-ish guy with a mop of curly hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. Arthur's mom had tracked down Officer Billy, who was now working as a security guard. "She did a lot to help you," Arthur's mom reminded him. "I think we should try to let her know." Officer Billy told Arthur's mom she'd already heard about the exhibit opening. Of course, Arthur thought. She knew everything. Officer Billy said she was pretty sure Judge Warner would be there because he was a board member of the museum. But Arthur couldn't believe the story when he heard it from his mom. A board member? Judge Warner had seemed like the last person on earth who would be interested in art. The rest of the people in the crowd were strangers to Arthur, museum staff and patrons and guests, and people who had a lot of money to spare by the looks of their stylish clothes and jewelry. Arthur was suddenly glad his mother had insisted on the suit. The museum had asked Arthur to be part of the ribbon-cutting group for the opening of the exhibit. There were 5 people in the group. One of them turned out to be Judge Warner. He was introduced as the Honorable Philip Warner, a board member and lifelong friend of the museum, just as Officer Billy had said. "From brick-throwing to ribbon-cutting," the judge whispered to Arthur with a half-smile as he handed out the scissors to everyone. "Now that's what I call redemption." Even 7 years later, he could still make Arthur nervous. On the count of 7, Arthur's suggestion, they cut the silver ribbon across the entrance to the exhibit. Cameras flashed as the bits of ribbon fluttered to the floor. The crowd watching in the hallway clapped. And then it was time to walk through the wide marble doorway to see Mr. Hampton's masterpiece on display for the first time. This was the moment Arthur had been most afraid of. He was worried Hampton's Throne would look smaller and less spectacular than he had remembered, the way things from your past often did. Had the pieces really filled half a garage once? Would people understand why heaven had been made out of junk? Would they see what Hampton had been trying to do? He needn't have worried. As the crowd entered the room behind him, there was a soft gasp. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. Mr. Hampton's masterpiece looked far better, far more beautiful than he remembered. In the darkened room, the red chair Arthur had found for Mr. Hampton's years before filled the center like a radiant throne. Around it, the foil-wrapped tables and chairs and pedestals and pillars sparkled in the spotlights. Metallic wings stretched outward. Stars caught the light. And at the top of it all, above the glittering thrones and tables and pillars, was the small cardboard sign Arthur wanted everyone to see. Fear not. For a long time, Arthur stood at the side of the room, watching as the museum guests filed in. He noticed how they spoke in hushed whispers as they entered the darkened space, and how they stepped forward to look at the intricate pieces more closely, then back, as if trying to grasp the scene from a distance, forward and back, like a dance. Arthur found it hard to resist pointing out to people that there was no way of seeing everything, no matter how close or far away you were from Mr. Hampton's work, or how many hours you stared at it. Some things in this world were meant to remain a mystery. The line to see Hampton's throne stretched out the door and down the hallway. It moved slowly, and just as Mr. Hampton had said, the people kept coming. At the reception later, Officer Billy came over to give Arthur a round metal tin. "I've switched from caramel corn to cookies," she told him. "Chocolate chip. Hope you like 'em." "Thank you," Arthur said, remembering to make eye contact and sound grateful. He had learned a few things from Officer Billy 7 years earlier. Groovy Jim stopped by to tell Arthur and Squeak that they should come and get a tattoo at his shop sometime. "I can always use the business," he joked. "Hey, I just got one," Squeak said, rolling up his sleeve to show it off. "Look!" Groovy Jim and Arthur had to squint to see what it was. It looked like a tiny smudge of letters on his biceps. F equals MA. "Newton's second law of motion," Squeak prodded Arthur. "Force equals mass times acceleration. Remember that from high school?" "Oh, yeah," Arthur laughed. "Man, I cannot believe you did that. I thought you were going to get something big and scary. That's what you always said." Squeak grinned. "Trust me, getting this little thing was scary enough." Arthur and Squeak stayed until the end of the reception. It seemed like everybody had heard how they were the ones who had saved the throne. People kept coming over to ask them what Mr. Hampton had been like and what they'd done. Arthur figured he and Squeak must have told the story of the coffee cans 10 or 15 times. When Arthur and his family finally left the museum that night with the last of the guests, it was dark outside. As they came out, he couldn't help noticing the big flock of city pigeons that had gathered on the museum steps for the night. There must have been 50 birds, he thought. As the group started down the steps, the flock suddenly took off together, moving upward like one big cloud. Everyone stopped to watch them. You could hear the beat of their noisy wings lifting into the night sky, dozens upon dozens of metallic paper wings rising over the city. Arthur smiled as he watched the birds disappear into the darkness, remembering his dad again, remembering what Mr. Hampton had said. Some angels are like peacocks. Others are less flashy, like city pigeons. It all depends on the wings. And that's the end of the story, but I'll come back with another video to share the author's note, which you're going to want to hear.